The afternoon sun hung low over the manicured streets of Lexington, Kentucky, casting soft golden light across the polished sidewalks and pristine lawns of the wealthier neighborhoods. This was the side of town where wealth whispered instead of screamed, where money translated into quiet authority and an unspoken understanding that not everyone was welcome. Officer Travis Mitchell sat in his patrol car, his fingers drumming idly against the steering wheel, his eyes scanning the passing cars with the same deep-seated suspicion that had defined his career for over 2 decades. To Mitchell, police work wasn't just about enforcing the law, it was about maintaining order, ensuring that certain people knew their place, and protecting neighborhoods like this, one from perceived threats that didn't fit the mold. When the sleek black SUV glided past, its engine purring quietly, it wasn't speeding, swerving, or violating any traffic laws. Yet, something about it instantly caught Mitchell's attention. It wasn't the make or model, luxury vehicles weren't uncommon in this area, but the driver. Through the window, he saw her skin tone, dark and rich, standing out against the light-colored leather interior. A black woman, driving a vehicle that practically screamed wealth and success, moving through his territory as though she belonged there. The sight stirred something primal in Mitchell, a mix of resentment and entitlement that had been reinforced over the years by a system that rewarded his instincts and rarely questioned his motives. In his mind, people like her didn't live in neighborhoods like this, they invaded them. Beside him, Officer Brian Keller, a rookie barely a year into his career, glanced up from his notepad. "She's not speeding," Keller said tentatively. His voice was cautious, the voice of someone still clinging to the notion that policing was about right and wrong, not about unwritten rules and silent biases. Mitchell barely acknowledged him. "Let's find out," Mitchell said, his lips curling into a smirk as his hand reached for the patrol lights. The single burst of the siren sliced through the quiet street. The SUV's turn signal blinked on immediately, and the vehicle pulled over with a smooth, practiced ease that only irritated Mitchell further. There was no panic, no hesitation, just calm precision. The kind of poise that suggested confidence, perhaps even familiarity with traffic stops, which Mitchell found almost insulting. As they approached the vehicle, Mitchell rested a heavy hand on the roof, a gesture meant to establish dominance. The tinted window slid down smoothly, revealing Monica Bryant, her dark brown eyes steady, her expression neutral but alert. She wore a navy blue blazer, tailored perfectly to her frame, and her posture exuded control, the kind of composure that made Mitchell's teeth clench. "Evening, officers," she said, her voice calm, professional. "Is there a problem?" Mitchell ignored the greeting and barked. "License and registration." Monica moved deliberately, retrieving her documents with slow, purposeful motions, sliding them onto the dashboard before passing them through the window. Keller stood back, uneasy, sensing the tension thickening between his partner and the driver. Mitchell glanced at the license, Monica Bryant. The name meant nothing to him, but the vehicle, the clothes, the whole package, it grated on him. "What brings you to this side of town, Miss Bryant?" he asked, his tone laced with thinly veiled suspicion. "On my way to a meeting," Monica replied evenly. Mitchell's smirk widened. "Must be some meeting to afford a car like this," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. Keller shifted uncomfortably, sensing that this was veering far off script, but Mitchell had no intention of backing down. Without warning, Mitchell yanked on the door handle. "Step out of the car," he ordered. Monica's expression didn't change, though Keller noticed the faintest tightening of her jaw. "Is there a reason for this?" she asked, her voice still composed. "Step out," Mitchell repeated, his hand brushing against his holster in a gesture Keller had seen before, a silent threat that escalated compliance into submission. Monica unbuckled her seatbelt and stepped onto the pavement with the same smooth control, her every movement measured. Mitchell grabbed her arm, firm enough to make sure she felt it, his grip meant to remind her exactly who was in charge. Monica's bag slipped from her shoulder, spilling onto the ground, keys, a phone, and a leather-bound notepad. Without asking permission, Mitchell crouched down and began sifting through her belongings, his hands rifling through her property with casual disregard for protocol. Keller took a step forward, his stomach knotting. "Mark, this isn't protocol," he said quietly. Mitchell waved him off. "You've got a lot to learn, rookie." Monica's voice hardened slightly. "Officer Mitchell, you are violating my rights." Mitchell stood, holding up one of her credit cards between his fingers, his smirk widening. "You don't get to lecture me, lady. You're in my town now." Then came the moment that would seal Mitchell's fate. Keller saw it, clear as day, the subtle flick of Mitchell's wrist, the way his hand disappeared into his pocket, and the flash of a small plastic bag filled with white powder. In a single, practiced motion, Mitchell slipped it under the driver's seat, so smoothly it almost looked natural. Monica's eyes flashed with realization, her voice calm but firm. "That's not mine," she said immediately. "Nice story," Mitchell sneered. Keller's stomach churned, guilt clawing at his insides. This was the moment he should have spoken up. This was the moment everything inside him screamed to do the right thing. But fear rooted him in place. Fear of going against Mitchell, of being ostracized by the very officers he was supposed to rely on for backup, of becoming a pariah within his own department. So he said nothing. The crowd gathering on the sidewalk wasn't so silent. Phones were out, recording every word, every gesture, every moment of the interaction. A woman in the front called out, "We saw what you did. You planted that." Mitchell's head snapped toward her, his eyes narrowing. "Step back, ma'am," he barked, "unless you want to be next." But the woman didn't back down, and neither did the crowd. They had seen this too many times before, the routine humiliation, the abuse of authority, the manufactured charges, and they weren't afraid to call it out. Monica, still calm, still composed, turned her back and allowed Mitchell to snap the handcuffs onto her wrists. The metal bit into her skin, tighter than necessary, but she didn't flinch. "You have the right to remain silent," Mitchell recited mockingly, savoring every word. "Anything you say can and will be used against you." As he led her to the patrol car, pushing her forward with unnecessary force, Monica's expression never faltered. Behind her calm exterior, a storm was brewing, and soon Travis Mitchell would realize that he hadn't just arrested any black woman. He had just orchestrated the downfall of his own career. Keller followed a step behind, his heart hammering against his ribs, his conscience screaming. This wasn't right. This was never right. But fear kept his mouth shut, and in his silence, Travis Mitchell's crime was allowed to unfold. What none of them knew, not Mitchell, not Keller, was that Monica Bryant had already been here before. But this time, she wasn't just fighting for herself. She was about to make sure that Mitchell and everyone like him would finally be held accountable. The atmosphere inside the precinct was deceptively ordinary when Officer Travis Mitchell pushed Monica Bryant through the doors in handcuffs. His chest puffed out with the pride of a hunter dragging home a fresh kill. His smug expression was impossible to miss as he paraded her past the booking desk, his grip on her arm firm enough to make a point, but not quite enough to leave a visible mark. This was his trophy moment, the culmination of a traffic stop turned personal crusade to remind a black woman driving a luxury vehicle exactly where she stood in his world. Officers milling around the station glanced up briefly, some with mild curiosity, others with the usual apathy that comes from seeing the same scene replayed countless times before. Another suspect brought in, another routine bust. But Monica wasn't just another suspect. Her measured steps and upright posture radiated a calm authority that was impossible to ignore. Even with her wrists shackled in steel, her presence seemed larger than the cuffs themselves, as though they were a temporary inconvenience rather than a mark of guilt. Her silence was not fear, it was strategy, and as Mitchell led her toward the processing desk, Sergeant Anthony Delgado's brow furrowed slightly. He'd known Mitchell for years and had seen the man's shortcuts and biases play out before. There was something different this time, a tension beneath the surface, like the air just before a thunderstorm. Delgado's gut told him this wasn't going to end the way Mitchell thought it would. Mitchell, however, remained blissfully unaware. He tossed Monica's paperwork onto the counter, speaking loud enough for the entire room to hear. Caught her with possession, he drawled, shaking his head with exaggerated disappointment. Real shame, dressed like a CEO, driving a car like that. Guess some folks just don't know how to stay clean. He grinned, waiting for the usual chorus of chuckles and approving nods from his fellow officers, but the reaction was muted. There was no laughter. Instead, an unusual hush settled over the room, a faint crackle of unease threading through the air. Delgado's expression darkened. "You sure about this one, Mitchell?" he asked, his voice low but pointed. Mitchell's grin faltered, but only for a moment. "Come on, Delgado," he scoffed. "Black woman in a luxury car, nervous the second I lit her up. You do the math." Delgado's lips pressed into a thin line. There was no humor in his eyes, only quiet suspicion, but he didn't push, not yet. That was when the front doors swung open, and Deputy Chief Raymond Walker strode in, his presence cutting through the tension like a blade through fabric. His gaze swept the room, assessing, calculating, his expression unreadable, but his posture radiating authority. Officers stiffened instinctively, straightening as though they could sense that something important was happening. Mitchell, ever the cocky veteran, didn't register the shift until Walker's eyes locked onto him. "Officer Mitchell," Walker said, his voice calm but carrying the weight of command. "We need to have a conversation." The room froze. Mitchell's confidence wavered, though he covered it quickly with a forced chuckle. "Sure thing, Chief. Let me just finish booking." Now, Walker cut him off, his tone sharp enough to slice through any pretense. Mitchell's stomach knotted, though he couldn't fully explain why. He glanced at Officer Brian Keller, who stood near the wall, pale and visibly shaken. Keller had barely spoken since they returned to the station, the guilt of his silence gnawing at him from the inside out. Mitchell ignored him and turned back to Walker. "Chief, But Walker wasn't looking at him anymore. His eyes were on Monica Bryant. "Captain Bryant," Walker said, his voice calm, respectful. "Are you all right?" The room inhaled as one. The collective realization swept through the precinct like a cold wave, freezing every officer in place. Captain Bryant. The woman in cuffs, the woman Mitchell had paraded through the station, the woman he'd humiliated on the side of the road. She wasn't just anyone. She was their new commanding officer. Mitchell's face drained of color so rapidly that Keller thought he might actually faint. His jaw worked, trying to form words, but nothing came. Monica's hands, still cuffed, rose slightly. "I would appreciate it," she said with calm authority, "if someone would remove these." Walker's gaze flicked to the booking officer, who hesitated, caught between Mitchell's authority and the deputy chief's order. "Release her," Walker repeated, his voice leaving no room for argument. The click of the cuffs coming off echoed through the room like a judge's gavel slamming down in finality. Monica rubbed her wrists briefly, the red marks standing out against her skin. But she didn't flinch. She didn't rub them like a victim. She lifted her chin and turned, her gaze locking onto Mitchell, who stood frozen, his world crumbling piece by piece. "You didn't even ask my name," Monica said, her voice soft but deadly. "You didn't ask why I was there. You didn't ask for anything. You saw a black woman in a nice car, and that was all you needed." Mitchell's throat bobbed, but no words came out. You planted evidence, Monica continued, her tone flat. You fabricated a crime because you assumed I didn't belong. The silence thickened. Delgado's face was grim, but there was no surprise in his eyes. Others in the room exchanged glances, some uncomfortable, some grimly satisfied. Mitchell had always been untouchable, until now. Walker's voice broke the silence. "Officer Mitchell," he said, "hand over your badge and your weapon." The color drained from Mitchell's face entirely. "Wait," he sputtered. "This is a mistake. She's lying. She's your commanding officer," Walker said bluntly. "And you're done." Mitchell's hands shook as he fumbled to unclip his badge. The metal, once a symbol of power, now felt like an anchor dragging him down. His gun, which had always made him feel invincible, was suddenly heavy with shame. He placed both items on the desk with trembling fingers, the sound of metal against wood like nails sealing a coffin. Two officers stepped forward to escort him out, officers who had once called him a brother. Now they wouldn't meet his eyes. The walk of shame began, and Monica stood tall, watching him with a calm, unwavering gaze. She didn't gloat. She didn't need to. Her very existence was the lesson, the living proof that the old rules no longer applied. As Mitchell was led past the other officers, their expressions ranged from disbelief to quiet satisfaction. Some had suspected, others had known, but all had stayed silent. That silence had enabled him until now. The door swung closed behind Mitchell, and the precinct exhaled. Change had arrived, wearing a navy blue blazer and the unshakable confidence of a woman who had spent her entire life fighting to be exactly where she stood now. Captain Monica Bryant wasn't just here to command, she was here to tear down the walls that men like Mitchell had built. The silence inside the precinct didn't last long after Officer Travis Mitchell was marched out in disgrace. In its place rose a low hum, a mixture of whispered conversations, sidelong glances, and the unmistakable crackle of discomfort that settled into the bones of every officer present. For years, the department had operated under an unspoken code, a code that allowed officers like Mitchell to walk the thin line between authority and abuse, confident that the system would bend to protect them. But now, in a single afternoon, that code had shattered under the weight of a truth too large to ignore. Their new captain, Monica Bryant, was not only a black woman, but the very woman Mitchell had tried to frame. The officers who had once laughed at Mitchell's crude jokes, who had dismissed the quiet complaints about his conduct, now stood with arms crossed, unsure where to place their loyalty. Sergeant Anthony Delgado, a veteran with enough years on the force to see both the good and the bad of policing, felt the weight of it more than most. He'd known Mitchell's type, a cop who believed the badge was a license to enforce his own worldview. Delgado had always found excuses not to speak up, telling himself it wasn't his fight. That change was someone else's responsibility. But seeing Monica Bryant stand tall, wrists still red from cuffs Mitchell had slapped on her without cause, Delgado felt a pang of shame twist in his gut. Silence, he realized, had made him complicit. In the far corner of the room, Officer Brian Keller leaned against the wall, his face pale, sweat beading at his temple. Keller was young, still finding his footing in the culture of the precinct, and already he'd made the kind of mistake that could haunt a career. He had seen it, he had watched Mitchell slip the plastic bag under Monica's seat, and he had said nothing. Even now, his silence felt like a stone lodged in his throat. His father had been a cop, his brother too, and they'd both taught him that loyalty was everything. But no one had ever explained what to do when loyalty meant betraying his own sense of right and wrong. From across the room, Monica's eyes met his steady, calm, but with the weight of unspoken understanding. She knew. She didn't need to say it. Outside the precinct, word had already spread. By the time Mitchell's feet hit the front steps, a crowd had gathered, a patchwork of community activists, local residents, and reporters with cameras rolling. They were the same people who had watched officers like Mitchell patrol their neighborhoods with suspicion instead of service. The same people who had attended funerals for sons and daughters whose only crime was existing in the wrong place at the wrong time. They weren't just here for Monica Bryant. They were here for every name they'd chanted in the streets, for every family still waiting for justice. The chants started low, but gained momentum quickly, voices weaving together into a wall of sound. No more cover-ups, no more lies. It was a refrain born from years of broken trust, each word a reminder that the community's patience had long since worn thin. The cameras captured every moment: Mitchell's pale face, his clenched jaw, the flash of panic in his eyes as he realized the world was watching. He'd once believed the shield on his chest made him untouchable. Now it was gone, and all that remained was a man exposed for what he truly was. Monica didn't follow him outside. She remained at the heart of the precinct, a living symbol of the shift that was beginning to unfold. Her very presence was a disruption to the status quo, a black woman in a position of power, refusing to shrink, refusing to apologize for existing. Officers filtered in and out of the room, their gazes flicking toward her, some with curiosity, others with resentment. There were those who saw her as a threat, a reminder that the rules they'd always relied on were no longer guaranteed. Others, however, saw something else, a chance to rebuild trust, to reshape what it meant to wear the badge. Deputy Chief Raymond Walker stood beside her, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. He was old enough to remember the last time a captain had tried to challenge the culture of silence within the department, and how quickly that captain had been pushed out. But there was something different about Monica Bryant. She wasn't here to ask for permission. She wasn't here to play the game by their rules. She was here to rewrite them. "Hell of a first day," Walker said quietly. Monica's mouth twitched in something that wasn't quite a smile. "I've had worse," she replied. Back outside, the crowd continued to swell, and the energy shifted from protest to something closer, to celebration. It was a rare thing to see justice served in real time, to see a corrupt officer not only exposed, but held accountable before the ink had dried on his fabricated reports. Community leaders took turns speaking, their voices carried over portable speakers, blending personal stories with calls for systemic change. They didn't just want Mitchell gone, they wanted the entire culture that had protected him dismantled, brick by brick. Inside, Monica walked slowly through the precinct, taking in the space that now belonged to her. Every desk, every chair, every case file represented a piece of the world she was now tasked with shaping. She knew there would be backlash. Officers who had counted on the old ways to shield their misconduct would see her as the enemy. Some would resist her leadership, sabotage her efforts, and quietly hope she failed. Others, though, would see her as a chance to be better, to serve the community instead of occupying it, to protect rather than control. Sergeant Delgado met her near the back of the room. "Not everyone's going to be happy about this," he said, his voice low but honest. Monica met his gaze squarely. "I'm not here to make them comfortable," she said. Delgado's lips pressed into a thin smile. "Good," he said, "because you just kicked the hornet's nest." At the edge of the room, Keller lingered, caught between guilt and hope. He knew what he'd done, or rather, what he'd failed to do, but Monica's presence told him it wasn't too late to choose differently next time. When her eyes flicked his way again, there was no accusation there, only a silent invitation to step up. The weight of change settled over the precinct like the first crack of thunder before a storm. What had happened to Travis Mitchell wasn't just a personal reckoning, it was a warning shot for every officer who had ever let prejudice shape their patrols, every supervisor who had ever looked the other way, every rookie who had learned to stay silent instead of speaking up. The old code was broken. A new captain was here, and this time, silence would no longer be an option. The fall of Officer Travis Mitchell was never just about a single corrupt officer getting caught. It was the unraveling of a culture stitched together by silence, fear, and the unshakable belief that a badge was a shield against accountability. For years, Mitchell had embodied everything wrong with modern policing: the unchecked power, the quiet complicity of his peers, and the belief that his uniform gave him the right to decide who belonged and who didn't. His downfall, however, was the product of something much larger than his own arrogance. It was the direct result of a system that had protected him, elevated him, and ignored every warning sign along the way. And for once, that system was forced to confront the cost of its own indifference. At the center of this storm stood Monica Bryant, not just as an individual victim of Mitchell's abuse, but as a symbol for every black person who had ever been pulled over for existing in the wrong neighborhood, for every mother who had to coach her children on how to survive a traffic stop, and for every family who had seen justice denied before it could even begin. Monica's calm defiance, her refusal to shrink in the face of Mitchell's manufactured authority, wasn't just her own act of courage. It was an echo of generations who had stood in that same place, hands pressed against car hoods, faces against pavement, dignity stripped away by men like Mitchell, who saw skin color as probable cause. What made Monica's story powerful wasn't just her personal victory, but the context in which it unfolded. She didn't just prove Mitchell wrong, she did it in front of an entire precinct that had, for too long, accepted his version of policing as normal. Every officer who had ever seen Mitchell bend the rules, every superior who had ever excused his shortcuts, and every rookie who had learned that silence was safer than speaking up, each of them was implicated in his downfall. Because Mitchell didn't create the culture he operated in, he thrived in it. He was its most confident product, and the system had rewarded him for it. The weight of that truth hung heavy in the air, both inside the precinct and in the streets outside. By the time Monica removed her own handcuffs and revealed her badge, the world was already watching. Footage from bystanders had spread online in real time, transforming her from an anonymous victim into a symbol of something far greater. She was no longer just Captain Monica Bryant. She was proof that the old rules could be rewritten, that silence could be broken, and that the system, no matter how deeply entrenched, was not immune to change. But the symbolism of Monica's rise and Mitchell's fall went even deeper. It exposed the fundamental lie at the heart of policing in communities of color, the lie that compliance guarantees safety, that if you just follow orders, you'll be fine. Monica had done everything right. She signaled properly, pulled over calmly, answered every question, and never raised her voice. And still, Mitchell saw her as a threat. Her car was too nice. Her posture was too confident. Her skin was too dark. In his mind, those were all the reasons he needed to manufacture her guilt. It wasn't her actions that mattered. It was the story he had already written in his head before her window even rolled down. That's why Monica's victory was so significant. She didn't just clear her own name, she shattered the narrative that officers like Mitchell rely on. She exposed the lie that every black driver knows too well, that innocence isn't enough, when the person judging you has already decided you're guilty. And by exposing that lie, she didn't just hold Mitchell accountable, she forced the entire precinct to reckon with the culture that made him possible. For officers like Sergeant Anthony Delgado, that reckoning was long overdue. Delgado wasn't a bad cop. He wasn't corrupt, and he didn't share Mitchell's overt biases. But he had seen things, heard comments in the locker room, watched traffic stops escalate unnecessarily, and stayed silent when he knew someone like Monica Bryant would never have been pulled over if her skin had been lighter. His silence hadn't made him a villain, but it had made him complicit. And now, watching Monica take her place at the head of the precinct, Delgado knew his days of comfortable silence were over. The new captain wasn't here to preserve the old order, she was here to dismantle it. Then there was Officer Brian Keller, the rookie whose conscience had been at war with his fear. From the moment he saw Mitchell plant that plastic bag under Monica's seat. Keller had joined the force believing in justice, in the power of good policing, in the idea that officers existed to protect and serve. But Mitchell had shattered that illusion in seconds, and Keller had stood frozen, unable to decide whether loyalty to his partner mattered more than loyalty to his oath. Now, watching Monica command the room with quiet authority, Keller realized that neutrality was no longer an option. In a department where silence had allowed men like Mitchell to flourish, speaking up would become the only real test of character. Outside the precinct, the crowd gathered not just for Monica, but for themselves. They were the people who had lived under the weight of men like Mitchell their entire lives, who had been pulled over, questioned, humiliated, and dismissed for no reason beyond their existence. They weren't just protesting Mitchell's actions, they were demanding the end of the system that had made him inevitable. Every chant, every sign, every raised fist was a declaration that the community would no longer accept silence as the price of survival. Monica understood that her victory was only the beginning. Taking Mitchell's badge didn't dismantle the culture that created him. Becoming captain didn't erase the mistrust that decades of abuse had planted between the department and the community. But it was a start, a crack in the foundation, a shift in the balance of power. It was proof that resistance could lead to accountability, that silence could be broken, and that justice, no matter how long delayed, was still possible. She also knew that her presence would be a constant threat to those who wanted to preserve the old ways. There would be officers who resented her, who saw her leadership as an affront to the unspoken rules that had governed the department for decades. They would test her, challenge her authority, and try to push her out, but Monica had spent her entire career preparing for that fight. She didn't climb the ranks by playing it safe. She climbed them by refusing to shrink in rooms where she was never meant to belong. And now she belonged not just because of her rank, but because of her resilience. Her story wasn't just a personal triumph, it was a blueprint for every officer who had ever been told to keep their head down, every rookie who had been warned that speaking up was career suicide, and every community member who had been taught that justice wasn't meant for them. Monica Bryant had turned the tables, not just on Travis Mitchell, but on the culture that had allowed him to thrive. Her message was clear. The days of unchecked power were over, and the future of policing would be shaped not by silence, but by accountability. Justice, she knew, wasn't a destination. It was a fight, one that had to be waged every day, in every traffic stop, every arrest, every policy decision, and every uncomfortable conversation. Monica Bryant wasn't just ready for that fight, she was the fight. And now the whole world was watching. As we walk through life, especially those of us who have lived long enough to see the tides of history shift, we are reminded again and again of a simple truth. Silence can be dangerous. Silence, when faced with injustice, doesn't protect the innocent, it protects the guilty. The story of Captain Monica Bryant is not just the story of one woman's strength. It's the story of how silence allows injustice to grow roots, and how courage, even the quiet kind, can change the course of an entire community. Many of us, especially those of us in our golden years, have witnessed moments when someone was mistreated. Maybe it happened to us, or maybe it happened to someone we knew, a neighbor, a friend, or even a stranger on the bus. We were taught to mind our own business, to avoid trouble, to hope that the system or someone else would make things right. But if we've learned anything in our decades on this earth, it's that justice doesn't arrive on its own. It needs a voice. It needs someone willing to say, "This isn't right." Captain Bryant's story reminds us that appearances often deceive. Too often, people are judged not by their character, but by the color of their skin, the car they drive, or the neighborhood they're passing through. Many of us were raised to believe that if we follow the rules, if we show respect, if we know our place, we'll be safe. But as we've seen time and time again, even the most respectful, law-abiding people can find themselves targeted because of someone else's prejudice. Respect is important, but it must go both ways. Authority should serve the people, not control them. For those of us who have spent a lifetime building wisdom, this story offers a profound lesson. Your voice has value, no matter your age. Whether you're 70, 80, or even 90, your experiences, your stories, your sense of right and wrong, these are treasures. They are guiding lights for the younger generation, who are still finding their way in a world that too often feels chaotic and unjust. The courage to speak up, to bear witness, to say, "I saw what happened and I will not stay silent." This is the kind of legacy we can leave behind. There's another lesson here, one we might hesitate to admit. Sometimes silence makes us complicit. That young officer who watched the evidence being planted, who felt the knot in his stomach tighten but said nothing. How many times in our own lives have we witnessed something wrong and convinced ourselves it wasn't our place to intervene? Maybe it was a neighbor mistreating their child. Maybe it was a friend making an unfair assumption about someone different from them. Maybe it was a community leader abusing their power. Every time we stayed silent, we gave a small piece of our power away. But here's the beauty of life. It's never too late to reclaim your voice. No matter how many years you've lived, no matter how many moments of silence you regret, you can always decide to speak up now, for yourself, for your neighbors, for the world you'll leave behind. You are the keepers of memory, the bearers of wisdom, and your voice matters now more than ever. So today, let this story be more than something you watched. Let it spark a conversation with your children, your grandchildren, your friends at the senior center. Share your own stories of injustice and courage. Let's keep this dialogue going, because justice isn't just for the young, it's for all of us. If this message resonated with you, please like this video, leave a comment sharing your own experiences with injustice and courage. And most importantly, subscribe to this channel so we can continue bringing you stories that matter. And if you believe someone in your life, a friend, a neighbor, a family member could benefit from this message, please share this video with them. Your voice has power. Let's use it together.